Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive on Edmund Kemper in our ongoing series on Santa Cruz, California, murder capital of the world. Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. Come and hear the conclusion to the horrible and dreadful story of the most nefarious of the Santa Cruz killers, the Big Daddy himself, 6'9", 300-pound Edmund Emil Kemper, the infamous Coed killer.
Let's begin. Chapter 1, Big Ed and the Murder Capital of the World. When we last left you, Edmund Kemper, after murdering 3 hitchhikers and driving about with the head of one in his trunk, which he says attracted stray dogs, well, Ed had successfully had his juvenile record, which included the murder of his grandparents, permanently sealed, giving him a completely clean slate. And to celebrate, he headed to a sports emporium in Watsonville and purchased a .22 Ruger automatic pistol with a 6-inch barrel.
The little .22 bullets held a fondness in Ed's heart, as the rifle given to him by his beloved grandfather, the only person on the planet he's ever said to truly love, was also a .22, and would be the very rifle he used to kill the man. Though why Ed got a pistol with a 6-inch barrel is a bit of a mystery, as it's a very long and awkward weapon, difficult to conceal. Maybe it was because it looked just like the gun Manson family member Tex Watson used during the Tate murders. But who knows?
Ed would later tell Front Page Detective magazine,
"Oh, I went bananas after I got that gun." And a quick side note, researching this is kind of fun because it was the time of the sleazy detective magazines, and you're always finding quotes from Kemper in places like Front Page Detective, True Detective, and Inside Detective. He loved giving interviews to these magazines.
And on the very same day that Ed bought his shiny new pistol, January 9th, 1973, he went on the hunt. So excited that he broke his own rule of never taking a victim from Santa Cruz, where he lived.
It was raining, a heavy drizzle, and the car windows were all fogged up, which Ed saw as a good sign, thinking no one could see him inside, when he spotted Cynthia Shaw, a 19-year-old Santa Cruz local, standing by the road on Mission Street, with her thumb held out, headed to Cabrillo Community College, where she was taking classes.
Ed was immediately overcome with bloodlust. She was pretty, with long blonde hair, dressed in a yellow jacket, a white blouse, and a checkered wool skirt with green hiking boots.
Hiking boots with a wool skirt is a very classic Northern California look that you still see today.
And the intelligent young girl hesitated when she saw the hulking man behind the wheel. But Ed had learned a little trick to disarm hitchhikers. Instead of trying to cajole her to get in the car, he acted impatient and looked at his watch, like he was busy and didn't care if she got in the car or not, as he had places to go and things to do.
The ruse unfortunately worked, and Cynthia hopped into Ed Kemper's Deathmobile.
Ed then whipped out his new toy, the .22 pistol with the long barrel, holding Cynthia at gunpoint, and headed to Watsonville, giving Cynthia the same bullshit story he'd given Aiko Ku, that he was suicidal and just needed someone to talk to.
Ed drove up into the hills and down a dead-end road where he told Cynthia he had to stop at his beloved mother's house. So weird how he always seems to bring his mother into these events. And so he asked Cynthia if she would get in the trunk while he visited his mother. And Cynthia actually agreed and went to the trunk, as Ed says, under her own power.
Ed had placed some folded blankets there to make it comfortable. And as the teenager lay down, Ed promptly shot her in the head. As Ed would later say,
"It amazed me so much because 1 second she's animated and the next she's not. And there's absolutely nothing in between. Just noise and then absolute silence."
Ed had recently moved back in with his mother, having blown through all the cash she received from accident settlement. But sharing a duplex with his mother didn't stop him from taking the fresh corpse there and shoving it into a cupboard, where he let it sit for a couple of days before dismembering it.
It's really disturbing that he's now letting the body sit for a while, as if he'd come to associate the smell of death with pleasure. And another incredibly disturbing thing, he said he preferred having sex with the bodies after rigor mortis had set in.
While his mother was at the university working, Ed did his disgusting thing, dissecting her, having sex with the various body parts, eating her flesh, cooking it up with butter, mushrooms, and onions. He then did something so bizarre that it's become infamous in true crime. He buried her head right there in the courtyard of the apartments, under a stepping stone, so that she was looking up into his mother's window, saying,
"Mother always wanted people to look up to her." Ugh, what a terrible pun. It's so crazy, though, especially when you look at pictures of this place, because there's like units on either side of him. It's right there in front of multiple doors. So brazen. And one neighbor even had 3 young daughters, and these sisters were known to be pesky and always poking about.
absolutely crazy. He'd later say,
"Sometimes at night, I talk to her, saying love things, the way you do to a girlfriend or wife."
he took all of Cynthia's clothing to a laundromat in Oakland, put them in the dryer, placed it on high, and left. When he returned hours later, the clothing was all gone. He laughed, thinking how someone had thought they'd made a score and were now wearing the clothing of a murder victim.
He took some of the body parts south, down Highway 1 to Big Sur, one of the most beautiful places on the planet, and dumped them on the side of the road, where they were sure to be seen. A garbage bag with a human arm poking out of it. A highway patrol officer discovered it the next morning. And I have to say, it's so nice that law enforcement found this and not a group of children, which seems to disturbingly be the case most of the time.
He tossed the rest off a cliff and out into the ocean, where they began to wash ashore. A mutilated and decomposing torso was found in a lagoon just outside Santa Cruz. A surfer in Capitola found a left hand floating in the waves. The pelvis washed up on the beach in Santa Cruz.
Drinking at the jury room bar with his cop pals, Ed was delighted to discover that Cynthia had been the babysitter for Santa Cruz police officer Jim Connor. And so Ed pestered Jim for details about the girl.
Newspapers were now writing articles about the body parts washing ashore, calling the killer the chopper and the butcher. And Ed would sit and drink with the police, asking them about all they knew, making crude jokes. The university began distributing flyers saying, "Do not hitchhike, please."
Tom Honig wrote an article in the Santa Cruz Sentinel saying, "What the hell is happening to our little paradise?"
Television reporters began to speculate that there was a satanic Manson-like cult at work, saying the bodies had been exsanguinated or drained of blood. Then speculated that the killer was an angry lesbian or transvestite. They couldn't have been more wrong about everything. The bodies hadn't been exsanguinated or sacrificed during a ceremony. There was no cult. Herbert Mullin was a devout Catholic, and Ed Kemper was a heterosexual man. But regardless, the sleepy surf town of Santa Cruz was fast becoming the murder capital of the world.
While the university was actively warning students to not hitchhike, the truth was, hitchhiking was a way of life, a culture in sunny California. And life went on. Ed continued picking up hitchhikers, and unfortunately, the university stated that anyone who had a parking sticker for UC Santa Cruz on their car could be trusted. When Ed heard this, he pressured his mother, who had worked at the university since its opening, to get him one of those stickers, which she did, even getting him the coveted A sticker, which gave him full access to all areas of the university.
Like, you have to wonder if she suspected anything when he asked her to get him that. Like, come on.
It's weird. I saw some interviews with his sisters who said that they actually suspected it. And the one sister was like, well, don't say anything to mom because she's already stressed out enough.
Jesus. Let's not stress out mother, but keep letting Coeds get murdered. And then on February 5th, 1973, Ed Kemper again went out on the hunt for co-ed college girls, fueled by a recent heated argument with his mother, saying,
I was so pissed, I would have killed anybody who got into my car.
Ed's mother was now telling him that he'd never find a girlfriend, never find love, that he was too picky, that the young, pretty girls he liked could never love a monster like him. Ed was determined to show her, to show them, to show the world he could have pretty young college girls. He'd just take them right off the street and make them his forever.
Rosalind Heather Thorpe was 22, a graduate student studying psychology, whom friends describe as a, quote, free spirit, bright, bouncy, huggy, and lively.
Rosalind usually rode her bicycle the short distance to the university, but the sun was setting, it was growing dark, and the roads were slick and foggy from the rain earlier that day. So she put on a thick navy pea jacket, left her bike at home, and went to the bus stop instead.
Ed Kemper pulled up to the bus stop in his yellow Ford with the new UC Santa Cruz parking sticker on the bumper, rolled down his window and said, "The bus is gone. I know I've missed it before too. Can I give you a ride?"
Not wanting to miss her psych class, the pretty graduate student hopped in the lumbering 300-pound psychopath's car.
Ed drove along and, feeling emboldened, actually picked up another hitchhiker, 22-year-old Alice Helen Liu, also a graduate student studying political science, who went to the university on a full scholarship, writing on her application form, quote, "I want to change the world through government. I want to be involved with the core of people, and I can do both by being a political science teacher."
Most likely Alice, seeing a couple in the car, as well as the UC Santa Cruz parking sticker, deemed it to be a very safe ride. As Ed said,
"I noticed Alice, who sees us and gives us her most beautiful smile, thumb raised, a gesture of great beauty. She does it very naturally, with a lot of grace."
Ed pulled over, and Alice hopped into the back seat of the Deathmobile. And as he drove along the winding roads toward the university, perhaps listening to Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which was the #1 hit at the time on the FM radio, they reached an open, flat spot, and Ed pointed out the magnificent view of the distant mountains, draped in fog and highlighted by the last glimmering rays of the sinking sun. And when the girls turned their heads and looked out the window to see, he pulled out his .22 and shot each of them in the head. This time, not even bothering to pull over. Ed would say,
Thorpe had a very broad forehead, and I was trying to imagine what her brain looked like inside her skull. I wanted my bullet to hit her right in the middle of the brain. A second before, she's still moving, and the next, she's dead. A noise, then silence. Absolute silence.
But as Ed Kemper drove along, coming up and passing by the university's guard station, and waving at the uniformed guards in the kiosk, them seeing his A sticker and waving back, Alice began to moan and gurgle in the back seat. As Ed says,
It was a sigh. A very strange sigh. It was very disconcerting. I went straight down to Mission, turned right, and headed out on Highway 1, making sure I broke absolutely no rules and was doing my damnedest to look cool while I was freaking out about Alice Lou in the back seat there. The blood started running and gurgling and the moaning was still there. So as soon as I got out to the edge of town, I stepped on the gas and got the hell away from there. And a little further down the road where no cars were, I slowed down very slow, turned her head around to the side, and fired point blank at the side of her head.
Ed then pulled into the parking lot for Laguna Creek Beach, a popular surfing spot, now dark and deserted, put the bodies in his trunk and went to the gas station, filled his tank as he made small talk with the attendant, and drove to his mother's duplex, parking his car right on the street, going to the trunk, and decapitating both girls right there in full view of anyone who may have been passing by, later saying,
The one thing that amazes me about society is that you can do damn near anything and nobody's going to say anything or notice. I started flaunting that invisibility, severing a human head, 2 of them, at night, in front of my mother's residence. And all someone had to do was walk by, look out, and I'd have had it. I removed their heads and I went down and got cigarettes at this little bar by Seacliff, walked back, went to the house, watched TV, and went to bed.
The next afternoon, he went to the car, put Alice's head in a camera bag, and as he was walking it up to his mother's apartment, passed a happy couple on the redwood stairway. He nodded at them and was filled with a simmering rage that his neighbors were going out on a nice date while he was forced to have sex with a mutilated corpse.
Yeah, no one really forced him, did they? That was his choice.
Yeah.
After dismembering the corpses, having sex with the pieces, eating parts of them, all of which had now become a routine, he drove the butchered remains out to an area known as Devil's Slide in San Mateo County and tossed the body parts out into the ocean and the surrounding hills.
Chapter 2, Murderville, USA. The disappearance of Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Lou, 2 vibrant coeds on their way to class, caused an absolute panic at the university, while Santa Cruz itself reached a fever pitch of homicidal insanity. 16-year-old Wilfried Brown raping and murdering Ida Stein as he went door-to-door selling soap. Herbert Mullin, whom we covered last week, leaving bodies everywhere, 8 shot, 1 beaten to death with a bat. A priest stabbed to death in the confessional booth, and the savage killing of Mary Guilfoyle, who'd been stabbed and dismembered. Trees decorated with her viscera. A murder that puzzled Ed himself, as it seemed like one he would commit. Much different than the random shootings.
And the unknown killer leaving body parts strewn through the redwoods and pristine beaches was now being given names. True Detective magazine called him the Buzzsaw Butcher. As it appeared, power tools may have been used to dissect the bodies. Local teens whispered of the hitchhike chopper, and the academics at the university simply called him the Coed killer. Newspapers described Santa Cruz as Murderville, USA, and the district attorney himself called the beach town the murder capital of the world.
The campus handed out missing flyers for Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu. Boy Scouts, forest workers, and search teams scoured the woods. 13 Santa Cruz sheriff's deputies combed the area on horseback with cadaver dogs. The girls had just disappeared into the fog-drenched night, never to be seen again.
Eventually, a road crew in Eden Canyon spotted what they thought were mannequins dumped in a steep ravine by a rusted-out and discarded water heater. Only it wasn't mannequins. Of course it wasn't. It was 2 headless corpses.
A hiker in Devil's Slide would find their heads a few weeks later. The campus now handed out flyers saying, "Everybody needs a body. Save yours. Don't hitchhike."
Murder was all anyone could talk about, and Ed was soaking up all the craziness, absolutely enthralled. He would hang out at the jury room bar, asking questions. As he said, "I used the friendship bonds I'd woven with these policemen to learn more about the progress of the investigation. I had no problem getting information out of these officers. Why? They see themselves as the cream of the crop, and they like to brag about their exploits in front of other cops. I didn't care about being their friend. I had already been to prison. I didn't like the police. But they were talking to each other about what they'd heard. Usually any citizen who speaks to a police officer in uniform is clumsy, as if he's guilty of something, even if he's clean. But I don't act that way. If I don't treat them like an insect under the microscope, then I've slipped a foot in the crack of the door. Little by little, you learn to pay for beers and get to know each other."
Ed also enjoyed hanging out at gun shops, getting friendly with the owners, discussing firearms and theories about all the murders, watching the frenzy of people buying guns to protect themselves from the buzzsaw butcher.
Ed was greatly amused when a pretty young woman bought a .38 pistol, watching as she awkwardly tried to shove the weapon into her purse, as she said she was ready to kill the murderer stalking their little town.
For a moment, Ed was tempted to follow her out to her car, kidnap her, shoot her before she had the chance to shoot him, and cut off her head.
Grinning idiotically, Ed Kemper was lost in this daydream when the gun shop owner said to him,
"The guy who is doing this to the girls must be sick. He needs help."
Ed Kemper kept grinning and nodded in agreement. "Sure does," he said. "Sure does."
And during all of this insanity, Ed was somehow able to actually find love. Yes, you heard that right. Edmund Kemper fell in love and got himself a girlfriend.
He met a 17-year-old girl on the beach who was visiting Santa Cruz for the day, and they began dating, mostly just talking on the phone. She was a farm girl from the San Joaquin Valley, about 116 miles north of Santa Cruz. But he'd drive out and visit her and her family, spending the night in her brother's bedroom. She says that they never had sex and didn't kiss much, but he actually asked her to marry him, and she accepted. Ed was engaged, though they spent little time together. I mean, she lived hours away from him and was just a high school student.
Disturbingly, he gave her father the knife he'd used to murder Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Mary Lucchesa, and the family would use it to sheave corn off the cob for stew. Very, very little is known about this girl. When Ed was arrested, the family immediately moved and demanded their names be withheld as she was a minor. Ed would say this about her:
"I never thought of killing her, and she's very much the reason I eventually surrendered."
On February 13th, 1973, Santa Cruz was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief when murderer Herbert Mullin was caught immediately after gunning down 72-year-old Fred Perez, raking leaves in his yard. The murder weapons still hot and smoking in the back seat of his station wagon.
Ballistic tests quickly linked Herbert to all of the random shootings going on, but it would be Mullin himself who confessed to the other murders he committed, saying he committed them to stop a devastating earthquake from destroying California. And if you don't know what we're talking about, go back and listen to the episode.
And now all the talk at the jury room was about Herbert Mullin. Theories. Could he have killed the other hitchhikers as well? Could Herb also be the buzzsaw butcher and the Coed killer? Was he really crazy? Would the killings stop now that he was caught? Ed showed extreme contempt for the captured serial killer, boldly stating,
Well, anyone who just runs up to someone, shoots them, and then runs off has no class.
Then Ed would do a shot of tequila and show off his strength by lifting women off the ground and placing them atop bar stools, all his cop friends roaring with laughter over the strength of the goofy, gentle giant.
And the jury room, whose slogan is, "Come in and give us your verdict," is still there at 712 Ocean Street.
Ed laughed to himself. Now that Mullin was behind bars, hitchhiking started right back up again. He'd pick them up and drive them to the university, but he didn't feel any great desire for murder. His loneliness and desire for necrophilia slightly diminished now that he had a girlfriend and was engaged, even though she lived 160 miles away.
But another part of him wanted to up the ante, to do something even bigger than kill hitchhikers. He began to fantasize about entering a house in the middle of the night and just slaughtering everyone in it, then going to the next house and the next, something that would elevate him above Mullin and Frazier, whom he actively despised.
Began to long to be the king of the Santa Cruz serial killers, the king of all the killers. As he said,
Toward the end, I became sicker and sicker, more bloodthirsty, and yet these streams of blood annoyed me. It's not something I want to see, but what I long for is to witness death and to savor the triumph over the death of others. It's like a drug, which I want more and more. I want to triumph over my victims, overcome death. They are dead and I'm alive. It's a personal victory.
But the heat was on, and Ed knew it. While law enforcement may have caught Herbert Mullin, they knew there was another killer out there. The one leaving body parts scattered through the redwoods and the beaches. The butcher, the Coed killer, and there was a county-wide task force on a manhunt to catch him.
Ed found relief from both his desire to kill and the pressure from the task force in the bottom of a bottle. Like his mother, he was becoming a full-on drunk. With his huge size, Ed could easily polish off an entire gallon of cheap wine before even going to the bar and drinking beers and doing tequila shots with his cop friends.
And Ed's paranoia reached new levels when Santa Cruz detectives showed up at his house to confiscate the brand new .44 Magnum handgun he'd just bought. A huge gun made famous in the Dirty Harry movies.
Since Ed's juvenile record was now sealed, it's unclear how detectives were able to determine that he was a convicted felon and not permitted to own a gun. But Ed very much suspected it was his mother who'd ratted him out.
The tension in the little duplex reached new levels. Ed saying,
My mother and I started right in on the horrendous battles. Just horrible battles. Violent and vicious. I've never been in such a vicious verbal battle with anyone. It would go to fists with a man. But this was my mother, and I couldn't stand the thought of my mother and me doing these things. She insisted on it, and just over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether I should have my teeth cleaned.
Ed's mother even blamed her lonely life and the past 7 years being sexless on Ed, calling him her murderous son who scared off any potential suitor.
Ed would say it was these fights that drove him to want to murder, saying, "The only time people got killed was when she and I were fighting like cats and dogs. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't vent it any other way. I think they were surrogates. I was killing her, not them. I was attacking her station. I was attacking her stance in the university setting."
In April of 1973, Ed became filled with the compulsion to kill again and overwhelming rage inside him, driving him back on the hunt, again going to Berkeley and trawling down Ashby Avenue, and there, in the exact same spot as Mary Ann Pesci and Anita Luchessa had stood, was another pair of blonde and brunette hippie hitchhikers.
It was like a bizarre form of deja vu. They were almost like ghosts. It was unbelievable. And just as before, Ed pulled over. And just as before, the young girls hopped right in to Ed Kemper's Deathmobile.
The friends were headed to Mills College, south of Oakland, where they went to school. As Ed drove them past Oakland on Route 13, the girls, who were unfamiliar with the area, became confused and accused him of not going the right way, and actually started directing him out toward the desolate area where he'd taken Mary and Anita.
It was baffling, bizarre, surreal. But for Ed, it was also extremely annoying. All the times he'd taken girls out in the middle of nowhere and they hadn't even realized it. Now, he was actually taking these girls in the right direction, and they were getting mad about it, demanding that he take him out to the middle of nowhere.
The girls began to panic and pleaded with him, "Please, no, where are you taking us? Turn around, please turn around."
"Trust me," Ed told the whimpering girls. "Please."
The car grew silent as Ed drove Highway 13 down through Piedmont, past the tall redwoods in Joaquin Miller Park, and up to Mills College, and pulled to a stop in front of the girls' dormitory. The two teenage hitchhikers then leapt from his car and bolted to their dorm room without even a thank you.
Ed was perplexed. He didn't know why he hadn't killed them. They'd literally begged him to take them off onto a lonely back roads by Redwood Regional Park. And they were perfect. Everything he wanted in a pair of victims.
Chapter 3, Resurrection Sunday. On Good Friday, April 20th, 1973, Easter weekend, Ed bought his mother an Easter lily and brought it home. But she wasn't there, probably out boozing it up with her university friends.
Holidays were always difficult for Ed. He'd run away from his mother's house after a bitter argument on Thanksgiving a decade earlier, only to have his father take him on a Christmas trip to his grandparents a month later and abandon him there. Holidays in a Tuscadero had been sad, lonely, weird times. Now here he was again, alone on Easter weekend. He sat in the dark duplex, stewing, like a little latchkey boy, waiting for his mama, thinking how his 55-year-old mother was out at a party while he was home, alone, as usual.
He slammed a six-pack of beer, passed out, and awoke to find his mother up in bed reading a book.
Ed tapped softly on her door, poked his head in. His mother sighed, looked at him disgustedly, and said,
"Oh, I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now."
Insulted and feeling rejected, Ed told her no, he'd let her get some sleep, and slunk off. He slept for a few fitful hours, tossing and turning, his mother's words echoing in his head.
I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now. I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now.
Finally, at 5 a.m., the sky outside still dark, he shuffled down to the kitchen, where he opened a drawer, retrieving a claw hammer and a knife. Then, feeling that ancient anger and rage stir within him, thundered up into his mother's bedroom, where he attacked the sleeping woman with the hammer, caving her head in.
He'd done it. Finally done the horrible thing he'd been fantasizing about since he was 8 years old. The thing he thought of as he lay locked in the dark basement as a little boy. The thing he longed for as his mother beat him with a belt and told him to not dare make a sound. The thing he dreamt of when Clarnell told him he'd never find true love. That no decent girl would ever want to be with a monster and an idiot like him.
Edmund Kemper then hacked his own mother's head off with a sword, brought it into the living room, placed it on a shelf, and screamed at it for an hour straight before using it as a dartboard.
But still he could hear her voice in his head, echoing. I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now. I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk now. It was maddening. So he cut her tongue and vocal cords out and shoved them down the garbage disposal, hoping to pulverize them. But the larynx and heavy muscle of the tongue actually shot back out of the spinning grinder, Ed lurching backwards in shock, later saying,
"That seemed appropriate, as much as she'd bitched and screamed and yelled at me over so many years." And then, this is a doozy, folks, as if everything else in this whole damn case wasn't. He went to the bedroom, undressed his mother, spread her legs, and threw darts at her vagina, before having sex with both her headless body and her decapitated head.
Man, I feel like at this point we should be keeping a list of like the absolute worst things that we've covered. Not like worst cases, but like worst things incidents. Even within a case. And like, this would definitely be on the list. I think, and now I'm a little annoyed. Not that I really want to remember them, but it is kind of nice to like, I don't know, have a reference point. I've seemed to have blocked the other ones out of my head a little bit, although the Albert Fish letter is not going anywhere. Anyhow, Dr. Louis Schlesinger would later say, having sex with his mother's head, I don't know what it says psychologically because it's unstudied. All we can do is speculate.
Okay. Yeah, understatement of the year there.
Ed himself would later pontificate over it and give his own analysis, saying,
I came out of my mother's vagina and, in a rage, I went back in. I still loved my mother. It's hard for somebody to understand that you murder your mother through love. It isn't a rational process. It's a very painful process. I've got to still live with that.
Then Ed, just as he'd done with his sister's mutilated Barbie dolls, just as he'd done with neighborhood cats, just as he'd done with his grandmother and 8 hitchhikers, took the corpse of his mother and crammed it into his closet.
You know, so in horror movies, they say that closets represent the womb. How, like, final girls are always hiding in closets, like Jamie Lee Curtis in the original Halloween. And then they burst free to reverse the roles and become the attacker, and usually end up leaping through a window, which is said to represent rebirth. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, nothing about Ed Kemper makes any fucking sense to me. He's such a paradox and so full of dichotomies, especially as everyone who ever met this guy described him as incredibly likable, friendly, funny, relaxed, down to earth. And, you know, if you watch interviews with him, it's the vibe he puts off there as well.
Ed would later say about killing his mother,
This hand is the left hand of the Lord. I have always considered my mother as a great being, someone very fierce and sinister. She was always had a great influence on my life, and when she died, I was surprised to find that her death was like all of my victims. How vulnerable and human she was, which has left a mark on me and still shocks me today. The left hand of the Lord is the one he uses to punish, and I, that guilty and left-handed son, cut off my mother's left hand.
But sadly, Big Ed wasn't finished. He needed one more kill to satiate his horrible bloodlust and desire. A coup de grace, a denouement, an epilogue to his book of murder. And he called his mother's best friend, Sally Hollert, 59 years old, hoping to lure her to his house of carnage and terror.
But Sally didn't answer the phone, so Ed headed out to the jury room, where he drank beer and slammed tequila shots with his cop friends, asking him if they were getting any closer to solving the Coed butcher murders, showing off his strength by lifting folks up onto bar stools.
There, at the bar, Ed spied a guy who owed him $10, and he was suddenly overcome with rage.
That rip-off bastard. Ed decided to kill him for the offense, follow him out to his car when he left, and put a bullet in his brain. But, to Ed's surprise, suddenly the guy was approaching him, apologizing profusely for not paying him back earlier and giving him a crisp new $10 bill. Ed smiled, slammed the money on the bar, and bought the next round of drinks. What an afternoon at the jury room, I tell you.
Ed then went home and again drunkenly called his mother's friend Sally. This time, she answered. He told her his mother and he were celebrating, having a dinner party with a lavish meal, telling her to dress in her finest clothes, put on makeup and perfume, and be there at 5.
As Sally got ready for a celebratory evening with her friend and her weird son, Ed prepared the house for her arrival. He hid knives about, loaded his guns, readied garbage bags, blankets, and put his handcuffs in easy reach.
When Sally arrived at the door, all done up, Ed told her his mother had to run to the store and to come inside and make herself at home.
As Sally, who'd been out until 3 a.m. the night before, wearily made her way to the sofa, she exclaimed,
"Let's sit down. I'm dead."
The word struck Ed. Dead? What did she mean by dead? Did she somehow psychically know her fate? Was she testing him? What could it mean?
Then, forgetting all the instruments of death and bondage he'd hidden around the house, he simply walked up behind the elderly woman, reached out with one of his massive forearms, wrapping it around her neck, and squeezed as hard as he could while jerking her up and off the sofa, bringing her to him in a brutal and bizarre type of backward hug, stunned to realize he'd broken her neck and killed her instantly in the process, saying,
I didn't realize I had broken her neck, and her head was just wobbling around with the bones of her neck disconnected in the skin sac of her neck.
So freaking scary. This giant of a man can just grab her up and instantly snap her neck. I mean, that's terrifying.
Totally, ma'am. Ugh. Ed would later tell FBI profiler pioneer John Douglas that he'd had an orgasm while breaking her neck. And I think that Sally was sadly just a stand-in for his mother. You know, he'd gotten off so hard when he finally killed his mother that he had to have another one just like it, a duplicate.
Edmund Kemper then retrieved his handy knife and cut off the wobbly head of Sally Hollert, hopped into his car, and headed back to jury room, where he slammed beers and discussed the Coed killer with his policeman friends, telling jokes, slapping his knee, buying rounds for the cops and attorneys, staying till closing time.
Edmund Kemper then went home. Maybe, who knows, whistling and skipping to Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Maybe not, I don't know. But what is known, what he did tell us, is that when he got home, exhausted from a busy day of killing and drinking at the bar, he went up to his mother's room and passed out in her blood-soaked bed. The same bed where he'd beaten her to death with a hammer and decapitated her, so it was truly, truly blood-soaked.
Chapter 4. Ed on the Run. Early the next morning, Ed woke to what I can only imagine was one of the most horrific hangovers in history. Suddenly, the reality of everything he'd done came crashing down on him when he awoke in that gore-drenched bed.
There would be no escaping this. No hiding body parts and laying low while law enforcement tried to find the elusive killer. He had turned his mother's home into a literal house of horrors. Mouth dry, head pounding, drenched in sticky dried blood and gore. He crept down to the kitchen for water, thinking of that old game electric chair he'd played with his sisters as a child. Now, that game was looking to become a reality.
Overcome with waves of panic, Ed found Sarah Hollart's car keys and packed his guns and ammunition into her car. Then, knowing his policeman pals would discover this scene of utter carnage at some point, decided to leave a note, an apology of sorts, scribbling,
"Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just lack of time. Got things to do. Approximately 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of the horrible butcher. It was click, asleep, no pain, the way I wanted it."
Ed then went to Sally's car and started driving east, not knowing where he was going, just moving, eastward into the dawn, following Highway 17 up and over the Santa Cruz Mountains, through Blood Alley, said to be the most haunted highway in California, through the ghosts of Los Gatos and into San Jose, then north on the 5 and through the Central Valley to Interstate 80, and into the Sierra Nevada mountains, up, up, up through the foothills and gold country of Auburn, up, up, up to the summit, passing Donner Lake and Truckee, leaving California, place of his birth, and entering Nevada, then down, down, down into Reno.
In Reno, he rented a green Impala, loaded his weapons into it, and took Sally's car to a mechanic, saying it had an electrical problem, a short in the wiring under the dash, knowing that that was a mechanic's worst nightmare, and they'd be searching for a non-existent problem forever.
He then drove through the Nevada desert and into the canyons of Utah, drinking gallons of coffee and popping no-dose pills, past the Great Salt Lake up into the Rocky Mountains, making it almost to the Continental Divide, where he was pulled over for speeding by a Colorado patrolman.
But the hulking serial killer who'd recently murdered his mother and had been driving for days straight, crossing half the country, was somehow able to keep it together, act calm, and was let go with a warning.
But then, Ed decided to just say fuck it. He was done. He was ready to turn himself in.
He'd been up for 3 days, hyped on caffeine, no-dose pills, and pure adrenaline. Now he was crashing. They say part of what defines a serial killer is this cooling off period, this downtime after an emotional outburst of just insane violence. It's kind of like all those chemicals in your brain that turned you into a raving monster. just diminish.
And what was the use of running away? He was 6'9". Where was he going to hide? He'd be obvious to anyone, as Ed said.
Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer. Toward the end there, I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing. And at that point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said, to hell with it.
So he went to a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz Police Department, and they laughed and hung up on him. His friends from the jury room didn't take the call seriously and told him to call back in the morning when he'd sobered up.
In the morning, Ed was finally able to get himself arrested, sitting in a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, describing in detail the murder of his mother with a hammer. While Colorado police were sent to take him in prison, police in Santa Cruz went to his mother's home and confirmed the awful and grisly truth.
Just as Ed had said over the phone, his mother's face had been used as a dartboard, and her tongue and larynx lay near the sink where the garbage disposal had belched them out. The bed was soaked through to the springs with blood, and the officer, who knew Ed from drinking in the jury room, looked at the note and shook his head, hearing the gentle giant's voice in his head.
Sorry, gents, for the mess, but really had no time.
Also in the house was a letter from the White House addressed to Ed with a photograph of President Richard Nixon, thanking the serial killer who'd been a campaign volunteer for helping Nixon win the 1972 election.
Ed was brought back to the Pueblo, Colorado police station, where he gave a rambling confession, later saying he did so without being given a Miranda warning and being informed of his right to an attorney.
When he asked why he turned himself in, he stated,
I had to stop. I wish I had given up earlier. Those people would still be with their families and loved ones.
Santa Cruz DA Peter Chang flew out to Colorado with 3 detectives. Ed greeted them fondly, like they were old friends, and said he was anxious to get back to Santa Cruz, waiving his extradition rights and going voluntarily.
And road trip! The crazy group, like some kind of inappropriate comedy. The new young Asian district attorney who was seen as an upstart hippie to the conservatives in Santa Cruz, the 3 hardened homicide detectives, and the goofy, lumbering 6'9" serial killer drove Ed's rental car back to California, stopping at various local jails at night where Ed would sleep while the DA and the detectives got hotel rooms. And they'd all eat at fast food drive-ins along the way. You know, seriously, this road trip needs to be turned into a movie. I'm working on the script right now as we speak.
I hope you're serious.
I totally am. Would that not be the crazy?
It'd be wild.
Totally.
Wild. While at a MacDonald's, Ed saw 2 attractive women pass by and stared at them. Suddenly, he vomited, telling the detectives it was something that just happened to him when he saw a beautiful woman.
Fuck, man. He is so fucking weird. And all along the way on this crazy road trip, Ed just talked, telling the district attorney and detectives all about his horrible crimes, saying, when I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think 2 things. One side of me wants to be nice, get to know her, date her. The other side wonders what her head would look like on a stick. The head fantasies were a bit like a trophy, you know. The head is where everything is at. The brain, eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, cut off the head and the body dies. The body is nothing after the head is cut off. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in the girl's body without the head. Oh, fuck, man.
By the time they reached California, it was like they were all old friends.
Yeah, like we said, it seems like anyone who ever meets Edmund Kemper comes away saying what a nice, affable guy he is. a real sweetheart, funny and charming. So instead of going right back to Santa Cruz, they took a detour through the Bay Area. Ed showing where he'd picked up girls in Berkeley, then heading down Highway 1, showing them where he dumped the bodies, leading them to Old Santa Cruz Highway and off Summit Road, where Marianne Pesci's body was discovered, to Loma Prieta, where the pelvis bone of Anita Lucchesa would be found, to Rodeo Gulch Road, where an arm was discovered in a green plastic bag, and then over to Boulder Creek, to a shallow grave near Two Bar Road, where the rib cage and pelvic bone of Iko Koo was found.
It was like the most disturbing and grotesque Easter egg hunt ever known.
Then officers were dispatched to Ed's mother's duplex to search for the head of Cynthia Shaw, which attracted a lot of attention.
Reporters were already circling the site of the double murder, and neighbors were out in droves as cops began digging in the courtyard. And you have to see the photographs of this place to really appreciate it. There are connected units and doorways right there. It's a very open public space, and beneath that stepping stone, they found her skull looking up at the window, just as Ed had said it would be.
Santa Cruz Sentinel journalist Tom Honig, who was on the scene, said the smell of the rotting brain when the head was discovered has stuck with him his entire life, and he's never been able to forget it.
Ed was put in jail to await trial and grew depressed, attempting to slit his wrists with a sharpened pen clip, afterwards saying he turned the pen into the sword, playing with that old Edgar Allan Poe quote, "The pen is mightier than the sword."
Ugh, such a character. When Dr. Alfred Russo, the head doctor and former acting director of a Tuscadero hospital, was asked how Ed could have been deemed completely sane and rehabilitated, he simply said,
"Most of this work is a matter of an educated guess."
And Dr. Bernard Diamond, a Cal State Berkeley psychiatrist, said,
"I have no way to foretell a person's murderous impulses. I cannot vouch for your potential violence, nor my own."
Ed was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder on May 7th, 1973, and was assigned Santa Cruz Public Defender James Jackson, Chief Public Attorney of Santa Cruz County, who had also defended both John Frazier and Herbert Mullin.
James Jackson was a passionate lawyer who did his job to the best of his ability for all 3 of the infamous cases, believing the law has to be equal for everyone, and that all deserved the right of counsel and a good defense. For this, he was ostracized, given death threats, and even spit on in public. His house then caught fire. While it wasn't determined to be arson, the fire department was incredibly slow in extinguishing the blaze, and most of the house was destroyed.
Now, here's a truly, truly awesome part of this story. It's one of my favorite scenes in the whole saga of the Santa Cruz killers. So Ed was taken to San Mateo County Jail for his trial. And as the newest celebrity prisoner, he was given the priority cell, which had its own shower. Nicest cell in the whole jail block. And guess who had been in that cell before Ed got there? Herbert Mullin. And so Herb got kicked out of the nice priority cell and put into a regular cell with no shower right next to it, which pissed old Herb off to no end.
So Herb, to vent his frustration, would sing off-key all night, keeping everyone on the cell block up, and also rant and rave, talking his nonsense about earthquakes, the Die song, and Jesus.
Ed would shout back that he was a no-class killer and had stolen both Ed's modus operandi and his dump sites.
Ed would later say about Herbert Mullin,
"He was just a cold-blooded killer running over a 3-week period.
killing everybody he came across for no good reason. Huh. I guess that's kind of hilarious, my sitting here so self-righteously talking about that after what I've done.
So when Herb would sing in his awful high-pitched voice or go on one of his rants, Ed would lean through the bars and throw water into Herb's cell.
After getting doused a few times, when Herb heard Ed use his sink, he would hide in a corner. So Ed, who couldn't see into Herb's cell, worked out a system with the guy across the hall who had a clear view of Herb. And that guy would mimic in his cell where Herb was, letting Ed know where to throw the water.
How Ed was able to know exactly where in his cell he was utterly mystified Herb. As Ed would say,
I got him every time, and he couldn't figure out how I'd gotten so accurate.
Then Ed began to train Herb with peanuts. He'd ask small favors of him and reward him by giving him a peanut. Time to stop singing now and go to bed, Herb. Here's a peanut. Ed had a big old bag of peanuts and soon had Herb under his complete control. Ed would say about this,
That's called behavior modification treatment. The jailers were very pleased with me.
After having modified Herbert Mullin, Ed began to psychoanalyze him and grew to have empathy for his fellow serial killer, eventually saying,
Well, we were kindred spirits.
Ed was asked if he thought Herbert Mullin was insane, and he said, absolutely, he was positive of it, adding he'd seen lots of schizophrenics in Atascadero, and there was no doubt Mullin was one of them.
Chapter 5. The Trial. The trial for Edmund Kemper began on October 23rd, 1973. Just as Santa Cruz killers John Frazier and Herbert Mullin had done before him, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. In my opinion, though, he is absolutely the least insane of all three.
Interesting. So 3 psychiatrists were appointed to Eddie who told him how he'd make casseroles out of his victims. And they all found him to be sane and cognizant, not the least bit delusional or in psychosis. Stanford University psychiatrist Dr. Donald Lund, who'd also examined Herbert Mullin and John Frazier, took the stand and noted how both Mullin and Frazier killed out of some misguided sense of righteousness and psychosis, while Kemper killed with complete awareness, solely for his own sexual gratification, saying,
He does not suffer from hallucinations, but selects his victims for the purpose of venting certain deeply rooted sexual and sadistic urges, such as the need to mutilate parts of the victim's body to achieve sexual satisfaction.
On November 1st, Eddie himself decided to take the stand, explaining to the jurors why he wanted to have sex with the corpses of young women, saying,
Alive, they were distant. I was trying to establish a relationship, and there was no relationship there. When they were being killed, there wasn't anything going on my mind, except that they were going to be mine. That was the only way they could be mine. They were like spirit wives. I still had their spirits. I still have them.
Asked what made him choose a victim, he said,
It was all coeds, and it would only be if they were a possible candidate for death, which would mean they were young, reasonably good-looking, not necessarily well-to-do, but say a better class of people than the scroungy, messy, dirty, smelly hippie girls I wasn't interested at all in, though I suppose they would have been more convenient. But that wasn't my purpose.
And Ed was getting groupies. Yup, even back in 1973, before Ted Bundy, before Richard Ramirez, there were serial killer groupies, packs of girls packing the courtroom to see their heartthrob.
The judge even had to admonish the titillated girls to stop squealing and sighing.
At the end of the trial, the videotapes of Ed's confessions were played, which were too much for Ed to watch. He buried his head in his huge hands, sometimes covering his ears, his attorney eventually asking the judge if he could be excused while the tapes were played, and the judge fucking allowing it.
He's a charmer, that guy, man. I could see him there. He's probably just looked like a sad, sad little boy, which in many ways, I guess he was. Ed's lawyer declared that neurotics build houses in the sky, psychotics live in them, and psychiatrists collect the rent. And the jury must find his defendant innocent by reason of insanity.
The trial lasted 3 weeks, and on November 8th, 1973, after deliberating 5 hours, the jury found Ed both sane and guilty on all counts.
After the trial, Ed was allowed to walk over to the prosecutor's table to District Attorney Peter Chang, whom, remember, he'd gone on that wacky cross-country road trip from Colorado with, and shake his hand. Ed saying, "Mr. Chang, I want to thank you for your restraint during this trial."
Chapter 6. In the Clink and Doing Time. Despite the fact that Ed was found sane, he was still deemed mentally ill enough to be sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, often referred to as Disneyland North for its friendly, hospital-like accommodations.
And another of California's most infamous criminals had also been sent to Vacaville after having recently got off death row and been deemed just a little too crazy for San Quentin. Can you guess who?
None other than Charles Manson. Ed reportedly liked old Charlie and felt a kinship with him, as they'd both been raised in institutions and horrible and brutal criminal reform systems. The difference was Ed was a 6'9" murderer, and Manson was a 5'3" petty thief. So while Ed was able to hold his own and defend himself as an institutionalized teenager, Charlie had a tougher time of it. As Ed said,
I should have been raped. I should have been mutilated. I should have been screwed over, like Charlie Manson. He was raped as a kid in youth authority prison. Then he started raping. Then he's a leader and he's manipulating people.
An oversimplification, but while Ed felt a brotherly kinship with Charles Manson, Charlie hated Ed Kemper.
Charlie, like most hardcore convicts, considered sex criminals the lowest on the food chain and saw Ed as one of them. Charlie also loved hippie hitchhikers, saying the young girls Ed killed may have joined his family one day, and that the Manson family only killed rich pigs who were destroying the world. And snitches, man. But Ed Kemper, he was killing the young love, man, the flower children who were trying to turn the world on and break down society's rules, Jack. Them young love were the dreams you ain't dreamed and the world you ain't conquered. Shit, a long time ago being crazy meant something. Now everybody's crazy. Do you like wolf kebab raw fan, Jack? Know what I'm saying?
Ed became the model prisoner, offering himself up to the FBI for study, telling them there's others out there like me, and then describing in detail just what he meant by that, helping profilers develop the term serial killer and defining it. Agent Ressler said at one point when they were locked alone together in a cell, waiting for a guard to come after an interview session, Ed completely unnerved him by looking at him and saying,
"Boy, if I went apeshit in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to meet the guard. What could they do? Cut off my TV privileges?"
Then, smiling and telling the obviously uneasy FBI agent he was only joking.
Ed also allowed journalists from around the world to come and interview him, being very candid and honest with them about his crimes. And interestingly, In interviews, Ed didn't seem to harbor an intense hatred for his victims. He didn't call them whores, sluts, or bitches like so many these terrible serial killers do, demeaning and dehumanizing his victims. In fact, he spoke with respect and even gave them proper titles, such as Miss Coo, Miss Pesci, emphasizing that he never tried to hurt them. He never beat them or punched them. He just wanted to kill them as quickly as possible.
When asked in an interview what his greatest contribution to society was, Ed laughed, gave a gleeful smile, and said,
I taught women not to hitchhike.
This is pretty wild. The famous documentarian and filmmaker Werner Herzog faked being a psychiatrist and talked his way in to see Ed in 1974, and much later wrote an article about the experience, saying,
In a way, he made a lot of sense. Why he killed and how it all originated. Kemper was a very sensitive person. When you look at his hands, like the hands of a violin player, I remember he looked like an elephant with a Mozart soul.
Ed eagerly volunteered to have what he called psychosurgery, which at the time was called a cousin to the lobotomy, though the truth is there's very little, if any, difference.
The last lobotomy in the United States had been performed in 1967, and the patient had died as a result. So the procedure had long since been completely discredited and proven to be very unscientific and dangerous. Basically, the prefrontal cortex of the brain is just randomly sliced up. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. The doctors who performed these so-called operations had absolutely no idea what the procedure was actually doing to their patients. And to this day, the human brain is in many ways a mystery.
Over 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States from the 1940s to the 1960s, mostly to cranky housewives, juvenile delinquents, and gay men, all categories of people that were sadly considered dangers to society. Today, lobotomy and psychosurgery are basically synonyms, but in the 70s, doctors were looking for a new catchword that didn't have the stigma of the term lobotomy, and also throwing about other medical terms like stereotactic surgery, which is really just the most minimally invasive way to remove a tumor or lesion. But let's be clear, Ed didn't want a lesion removed. He literally wanted his brains scrambled, hoping to cure his violent impulses.
This shit is the most clockwork orange stuff ever. So Ed corresponded with a noted Santa Monica neurosurgeon who supported what he was calling stereotactic psychosurgery. And the doctor assured Ed that if he could operate on him, he would completely cure him of his compulsion for sex and violence, which is pretty much the literal plot of Clockwork Orange. Doctors trying to cure a criminal of the urge for sex and violence, and in doing so, taking away their free will.
Through brain surgery, the doctor said, Ed would, without damaging his IQ and great intelligence, or even his friendly demeanor and sweet personality, be cured of his proclivity for murder and necrophilia.
An anonymous donor even put up the cost of $4,600, which would be like 20 grand today.
And then, just like the famous book and movie, it was revealed there was a deeply political angle to the entire scheme. As Ed says,
It came to light that he intended to pursue this on a political level beyond the operation itself, that he was going to use all this political influence and medical influence to achieve a release for me.
This is literally, again, the plot of A Clockwork Orange, but unlike the cult classic film, the operation request was denied by prison officials in both 1975 and 76. And I guess we should state that the film had been released in America in February of 1972 and just may have been on people's minds.
If he can only perform good or only perform evil, then he is a clockwork orange. meaning that he is the appearance of an organism lovely with color and juice, but in fact, only a clockwork toy to be wound up by God or the devil.
With his hopes of his violent fantasies being erased through brain surgery dashed, Ed then pursued a new passion, reading books and recording them on tape for the blind to listen to.
Ed narrated as many as 10,000 books during his time in prison, which is insane. Classics like Flowers in the Attic. In fact, he did a lot of V.C. Andrew books. And he did noir books like The Glass Key by Dashiell Hammett. He even narrated Star Wars. Can you imagine Star Wars narrated by Edmund Kemper? How weird and wacky is that? And 224 of these books on tape are documented and can probably be found with a little digging. I was able to uncover a clip of him reading Flowers in the Attic. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Ed had a deep, melodious voice, and blind folks loved his narrations and would even come and visit him in prison to offer their thanks. It was all very rewarding for Ed, who was even given 2 trophies for his book narrating. He'd say,
I never had a trophy in my life. I never had a plaque, none of that stuff. Their visit here is so special. I can't begin to tell you what this has meant to me. To be able to do something constructive for someone else, to be appreciated by so many people, the good feeling it gives me after what I've done.
Epilogue: The Aftermath. Santa Cruz, which had been a sleepy little surf town prior to 1970, was never the same again after the murders. The people were jaded, hardened, making it just like everywhere else in America in the 1970s.
And it had its toll on the players as well. Peter Chang, who in 1966 was the youngest district attorney in United States history and was seen as a kind of hippie idealist, a musician, bringing in a new liberal era of acceptance and peace to Santa Cruz. After all the violence and murder, he fell into alcoholism. He ran for judgeship and lost. His wife left him. As he'd later say,
I lost my practice, my family, and everything that had been dear to me, but I would still walk 5 miles in the rain to be at the bar when it opened.
Peter Chang died of lung cancer in 2004.
Santa Cruz Sheriff Doug James began to drink heavily as well. He also began to mismanage the budget and was eventually defeated in an election by Al Noren.
Pat Litke, who'd been known as the hippie mayor, resigned in 1975.
Edmund Kemper has come up for parole many, many times. Sometimes he just waives his right to a hearing. Sometimes he doesn't even show up for the hearing, part of him knowing he doesn't stand a chance. Part of him probably wanting to stay institutionalized, saying,
Society is not ready in any shape or form for me, and I can't fault them for that.
In recent years, he's suffered 2 strokes. Now half his enormous face is paralyzed, and he constantly drools. He has diabetes and is unable to walk or even bathe himself, and is confined to a wheelchair. He's been in and out of prison medical facilities.
Edmund Emil Kemper III is now 75 years old and will next be eligible for parole in 2031.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Edmund Kemper, the Coed killer. We hope you enjoyed it, but we are still not done with Santa Cruz. For just 7 short years after the arrest of Big Ed, yet another serial killer would roam the redwood hills and pristine beaches of this seaside surf town, this time in the 1980s. Yes, yet another decade and another serial killer in Santa Cruz.
And we have a very special guest coming up for a bonus episode on Santa Cruz, California.
murder capital of the world that you're not going to want to miss. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. If you got a case you think we should cover, you want to let us know we got something wrong, you just want to say hi, feel free to reach out to us at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening. Catch you next time.